The day my boss humiliated me in front of the entire office. He thought it would be the moment that ended my career. For him, it was just another Monday meeting. For me, it was the beginning of something very different. But before I explain what happened in that conference room, you need to understand something about the company I worked for. Because the truth is, the person my boss thought he was humiliating was also the only reason his biggest client hadn't walked away yet. And he had absolutely no idea. 3 months ago, I worked at a mid-sized consulting firm in Chicago called Ridgewell Advisory. If you've ever worked in consulting, you know the type of company I'm talking about. Glass offices, long hours, PowerPoint decks that take 20 hours to prepare for meetings that last 20 minutes. Everyone pretending to be calm and professional while quietly competing for promotions. Ridgewell wasn't the biggest consulting firm in the city, but it had something valuable. One client. Just one. A manufacturing company called Harrison Logistics. That single client represented almost 40% of the firm's annual revenue, which meant something very important. Whoever controlled the Harrison account basically controlled the future of the company. Officially, the account belonged to my boss, Greg Whitman, senior partner, 48 years old. Expensive suits. Perfect hair. The kind of man who walked into a room like he owned it. And to be fair, in most rooms, he did. Greg had built a reputation inside Ridgewell as a rainmaker. Someone who could bring in big clients. Someone who knew how to close deals. But there was something about Greg that most people eventually noticed. He liked attention. And he liked control. Especially control over people he believed were below him. People like me. My name is Daniel Mercer. At Ridgewell, my title was Senior Strategy Analyst, which sounds impressive until you realize what it actually means. It means you do the work. You build the models. You prepare the analysis. You stay up until 2 a.m., fixing the slides before a client presentation. And then, someone else walks into the meeting and presents your work like it was their idea. That someone was Greg. For 2 years, that was our arrangement. I built the strategy. Greg took the credit. At first, I didn't care, because I wasn't working there for recognition. I was working there because of one very specific relationship. Harrison Logistics. The company everyone at Ridgewell treated like a mysterious giant client. But the truth was much simpler. I didn't just work on the Harrison account. I knew the CEO. Personally. His name was Michael Harrison. And we met 10 years earlier. Not in a boardroom. Not at a networking event. But in a university classroom. Michael had come to our business school as a guest lecturer. At the time, Harrison Logistics was still a growing company. Not the massive logistics empire it is today. Most students treated the lecture like a chance to hear a successful executive talk about leadership. But after the lecture ended, I asked him a question. Not about leadership, about supply chain efficiency. Specifically, why Harrison Logistics was losing money in regional distribution. He looked surprised. Then he asked me another question. Are you studying logistics? No, I said. Strategy. He smiled. Interesting. We talked for almost 40 minutes after the class ended. About operations, transportation networks, warehouse optimization. Before he left, he handed me a business card. Send me your analysis, he said. I thought he was just being polite, but I sent it anyway. 2 weeks later, he called me. And that conversation eventually turned into something unexpected. A professional relationship, not employment, not mentorship, just mutual respect. Every once in a while, he would send me a question. What do you think about this strategy? Would this expansion make sense? Sometimes I answered. Sometimes I didn't. But the connection remained. Years later, when Harrison Logistics decided to hire consulting support, Michael asked one simple question. Where do you work now? I told him. Ridgewell Advisory. 3 weeks later, Ridgewell signed the largest contract in the company's history. Greg Whitman took full credit for landing the client. And I never corrected him, because the truth didn't matter. What mattered was that the client trusted me, not Greg. Which brings us back to that Monday morning meeting, the one Greg thought would end my career. Every Monday, the strategy team gathered in the main conference room. About 15 people. Analysts, managers, directors, and Greg at the head of the table. That morning, something already felt tense. Greg walked into the room holding a stack of printed reports. His expression looked irritated, which usually meant someone had disappointed him. He sat down. looked around the room, then placed the reports on the table. "These numbers," he said slowly, "are unacceptable." No one spoke, because in consulting firms, silence is usually safer than volunteering. Greg continued. "Our operational model for Harrison Logistics is behind schedule." He flipped open one of the reports. 2 weeks behind. Then he looked directly at me. "Daniel." There it was. The moment everyone in the room realized who this meeting was really about. "Yes?" I said. "You were responsible for the distribution analysis." "Yes." Greg leaned back in his chair. "So explain something to me." His voice was calm. Too calm. "Why is this project late?" I already knew the answer. Because the delay had nothing to do with analysis. Harrison Logistics had changed their data reporting system 2 weeks earlier, which meant we needed new data sets. Something I had already explained to Greg. Twice. The client updated their internal logistics data, I said. We needed to rebuild the model. Greg shook his head slowly. "No." "What?" "That's not the problem." He tapped the report. "The problem is accountability." Now the room was very quiet. Because everyone knew what was happening. Greg wasn't asking for an explanation. He was preparing a performance lesson. Publicly. For the team. And, unfortunately, I was the example. Greg stood up, walked slowly toward the screen at the front of the room. "This," he said, pointing at the timeline, "is what happens when people forget something important." He turned around. "Consulting is not about effort. It's about results." Then he said the sentence that made the room shift uncomfortably. "If someone can't deliver results," he paused, "they become replaceable." Several people looked down at the table. One analyst shifted awkwardly in his chair. Greg walked back toward the head of the table. Then he said something that surprised even me. "Daniel." "Yes?" "You're off the Harrison account." For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. "Excuse me?" "You heard me. But I'm assigning the project to Stephanie." Stephanie looked shocked. Because everyone in the room knew something she didn't. Stephanie had never worked with Harrison Logistics. Ever. And Harrison Logistics had one rule. They only worked directly with me. Greg continued. "You can spend the next few weeks assisting other teams." The message was clear. Demotion. Public. In front of everyone. Greg folded his arms. "Maybe this will remind you how important accountability is." The room stayed silent. No one wanted to get involved. And honestly, for a moment, I considered saying nothing. Just accepting it, walking out of the room. Because Greg believed he had just removed me from the most important account in the company. But he didn't realize something. Something extremely important. The Harrison account was never his to control. It belonged to the relationship. And the relationship belonged to me. I stood up slowly. "Greg," I said calmly. "Yes? If you remove me from the Harrison project." "Yes? You should probably inform the client." Greg smiled slightly. "I'll handle the client." "Of course you will." The meeting ended a few minutes later. People quietly gathered their laptops. No one made eye contact with me. Which is exactly what happens in offices when someone has just been publicly humiliated. But as I walked back to my desk, my phone buzzed. One new message. From Michael Harrison. It contained only one sentence. "Daniel, are you still leading the Ridgewell team on our project?" I stared at the screen for a moment. Then I smiled. Because Greg Whitman had just made a very expensive mistake. And he didn't even know it yet. The message from Michael Harrison appeared on my phone just as I sat down at my desk. "Daniel, are you still leading the Ridgewell team on our project?" It was a simple question. One sentence. But inside a consulting firm like Ridgewell, that sentence had the power to destroy careers. Because if the client had to ask that question, it meant something had already started to feel wrong. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I leaned back in my chair and looked across the office. The room was exactly the same as it had been 10 minutes earlier. People typing quietly. Phones ringing. Consultants rushing to meetings. On the surface, nothing had changed. But the truth was, Greg Whitman had just made a decision that could cost the company its biggest client. And he still didn't know it. Across the office, Stephanie was sitting at her desk, staring at the folder Greg had handed her. The Harrison Logistics account folder. The most important project in the firm. She looked nervous. Which made sense. Stephanie was a good analyst. Smart. Hard-working. But she had never worked with Harrison Logistics. Not once. And Harrison Logistics wasn't the type of client you could simply hand off to someone new. They didn't like surprises. They didn't like consultants who didn't understand their business. And most importantly, they didn't like consultants who didn't understand their CEO. Michael Harrison was a very specific type of leader. Direct, impatient, extremely intelligent. The kind of executive who could spot weak analysis in 30 seconds. And the kind of client who expected the person presenting strategy to actually understand it, which was why our working relationship had always been simple. He called me. Not Greg. Stephanie walked over to my desk. Hey, she said quietly. Can I talk to you for a second? Sure. She pulled a chair next to my desk and sat down. I didn't know Greg was going to do that. I figured. I don't want you to think I asked for the Harrison project. I know you didn't. She exhaled slowly. Honestly, I'm kind of terrified. That made me smile slightly. Why? Because everyone in the company knows that account is basically yours. Was. She shook her head. No. Is. Her voice dropped even lower. Daniel, can I ask you something? Sure. How exactly did Greg land Harrison Logistics in the first place? I looked at her. Why do you ask? Because I checked the internal CRM system. And there's almost no record of the original client development, which didn't surprise me. Greg had entered the account into the system himself. After the contract was already signed, which meant the system showed him as the lead partner, even though he had never spoken to Michael Harrison before the deal. Not once. I shrugged slightly. Greg likes to simplify the story. Stephanie looked at me carefully. You mean he took credit for something he didn't do? I didn't answer. But the silence was enough. My phone buzzed again. Another message. From Michael Harrison. Daniel? Now I couldn't ignore it anymore. I typed a short reply. Still at Ridgewell. Why? The response came almost immediately. Your colleague Stephanie emailed our team this morning about the distribution model. I glanced at Stephanie. She was already reading something on her laptop. What did she say? I asked. She introduced herself as the new lead consultant. Stephanie's eyes widened. Oh no. I nodded slowly. Greg had moved faster than I expected. And now, the client had noticed. Michael's next message appeared. I thought you were leading this project. I was. I typed. There was a pause. Then another message appeared. What changed? I stared at the screen. There were a lot of ways I could answer that question. Corporate answers. Polite answers. Consultant answers. But Michael Harrison had never liked those. So I typed the truth. Internal decision. 5 seconds passed. 10 seconds. Then my phone rang. Michael Harrison. Stephanie looked at the phone screen. Is that? Yes. Oh my God. I stood up from my desk. I should take this somewhere private. Yeah. I walked toward the small conference rooms near the back of the office, closed the door, then answered. Michael? Daniel. His voice sounded exactly the way it always did. Calm. Direct. But there was something else underneath it. Confusion. What's going on? He asked. Greg reassigned the account this morning. Without telling me? Apparently. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then he said something interesting. That's not how partnerships usually work. No, it's also not how our contract works. That caught my attention. What do you mean? Our agreement with Ridgewell specifies a dedicated strategy lead. Yes. And that lead was you. Yes. Michael exhaled slowly. So they replaced the person who actually understands our distribution network, without informing the client. That appears to be the situation. Another pause. Daniel, he said finally. Yes? Do you want to stay on the project? That question was more complicated than it sounded. Because the answer wasn't just about consulting work. It was about something bigger. Trust. Michael Harrison didn't trust Ridgewell. He trusted me. And if I said yes, the project would continue. If I said no, the entire contract might collapse. I can't make that decision, I said. Why not? Because Greg believes he can manage the account without me. Michael laughed quietly. That's ambitious. Greg is very confident. I noticed. Another pause. Let me ask you a different question. Okay. Do you trust Greg to run this project? I thought about the past 2 years. About the meetings. About the presentations. About the analysis Greg barely understood. No, I said. Michael didn't sound surprised. I didn't think so. Then he said something that changed everything. I'm flying to Chicago tomorrow. For what? A meeting. With Greg. My stomach tightened slightly, because that meeting was going to be a disaster. Greg believed he had just demonstrated leadership. But Michael Harrison was not the type of client who appreciated surprises. What time? I asked. 10 a.m. That's soon. Yes. Then Michael asked the question that would determine how the next day unfolded. Will you be there? I hesitated. Greg removed me from the project. Yes. But I can still be in the office. Michael laughed again. Good. Why? Because I'd like to see Greg explain this decision. When I returned to the main office floor, Stephanie looked up immediately. Well? He's flying to Chicago. Her face went pale. When? Tomorrow morning. Oh my God. She ran both hands through her hair. Greg is going to lose his mind. Probably. Should we warn him? That was a good question. A very professional question. And, in most situations, the right answer would have been yes. But this situation was different. Greg had made the decision. Greg had taken control of the account. Greg had told the entire team I was replaceable, which meant Greg was now responsible for the consequences. I think Greg should hear it directly from the client, I said. Stephanie stared at me. That's cold. Maybe. But it's honest. Around 4 in the afternoon, Greg walked out of his glass office and clapped his hands once. Team. Everyone looked up. Quick update. People gathered near the conference table again. Greg looked energized. Confident. The kind of confidence people have when they believe they've just solved a problem. I spoke with the Harrison team today, he said. That was fast. Someone muttered quietly. Greg ignored the comment. They're excited about the new direction of the project. Stephanie nearly choked on her coffee. Greg continued. They'll be visiting Chicago soon. When? One of the directors asked. Tomorrow. Now the room went silent. Greg smiled. We'll walk them through the revised strategy. Stephanie slowly turned her head toward me. I said nothing, because Greg had just unknowingly scheduled the meeting that might end his career. Later that evening, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Michael Harrison. Landing at 8:30 tomorrow. Then another one. Let's see how confident your boss really is. I looked out the window of my apartment at the Chicago skyline. Because tomorrow morning, Greg Whitman was going to discover something very important. The Harrison Logistics account was never really his. And the moment Michael Harrison walked into Ridgewell's office, that truth was going to become very difficult to ignore. The next morning started earlier than usual. When I arrived at the office at 7:45 a.m., Greg was already there, which was unusual. Greg normally arrived around 9, but today he looked focused. Prepared. Like someone about to present a major strategy. Daniel, he said when he saw me. Yes? You'll sit in on the meeting this morning. That surprised me. I thought I was off the account. You are. Then why? Because Harrison Logistics still associates you with the project. So? So your presence will make the transition smoother. I nodded slowly. Greg believed he was controlling the situation. What he didn't realize was that the client had never agreed to the transition. At 9:58 a.m., the elevator doors opened. Michael Harrison stepped out. All gray suit. Calm expression. The kind of presence that makes an entire office feel smaller. Greg walked forward immediately with a wide smile. Michael, great to see you. Michael shook his hand politely. Greg. Then his eyes moved across the room. Until they landed on me. Daniel. He nodded once. And suddenly, Greg looked slightly less confident. The moment Michael Harrison stepped out of the elevator, the atmosphere inside Ridgewell's office changed. Not dramatically, not loudly, but in a way that every experienced professional immediately notices. Because when someone like Michael Harrison enters a room, people pay attention. Greg Whitman walked forward first. Big smile. Confident handshake. The kind of performance senior partners usually give when greeting an important client. Michael, great to see you again. Michael shook his hand politely. Greg. His voice was calm, professional, but his eyes were already scanning the room. And then they landed on me. Daniel. He nodded once. I nodded back. And for a brief second, Greg's confident smile tightened just a little. He noticed it too. Shall we? Greg said, gesturing toward the conference room. Of course, Michael replied. The strategy team followed behind them. Stephanie. 2 directors. A project manager. And me. Greg had insisted that I attend the meeting even though he had removed me from the project. Which was ironic. Because without realizing it, He had just invited the only person in the room who could contradict him. The conference room door closed. Greg walked to the front of the room like a man about to give a winning presentation. "Michael," he said, "we've made significant progress on the new distribution strategy." Michael sat down at the head of the table, not across from Greg, but slightly sideways. A subtle move. One that meant he was there to observe, not to be sold something. Greg clicked the remote. The screen lit up with the first slide. A familiar one. Because it was my slide. My analysis. My model. Just presented with Greg's name on the title page. "As you can see," Greg began confidently, "we've redesigned the regional distribution network to reduce operating costs by approximately 12%. Michael nodded slowly. "Interesting," Greg continued. "The key improvement is shifting several warehouse operations to a hub-based model." He clicked to the next slide. Stephanie sat quietly beside me. I could feel the tension in her posture, because she knew something Greg didn't. Michael Harrison had already seen this strategy, months ago, when I presented the early version directly to him. But Greg didn't know that. Greg believed he was introducing something new. Greg talked for almost 5 minutes, walking through charts, cost projections, logistics models. The room stayed quiet, until Michael finally raised his hand. "Greg." "Yes?" "Before we go further." Greg stopped. "Yes. I have a question." "Of course." Michael leaned back slightly in his chair. "Who built this model?" The room froze, because everyone in the room knew the answer. Greg smiled. "Our strategy team." Michael didn't smile. "I'm asking about the lead analyst." Greg hesitated for half a second, then said it. "I supervised the project." Michael nodded slowly. "That wasn't my question." Now Greg's confidence flickered slightly. "The analysis was prepared by our team," he repeated. Michael turned his head toward me. "Daniel." "Yes? Did you build this model?" Greg's face changed instantly. He hadn't expected that. The room went silent. I could feel everyone watching, waiting. "Yes," I said. Michael nodded. "That's what I thought." Greg cleared his throat. "Well, Daniel assisted with some of the analysis." That sentence was a mistake. A very big mistake, because Michael Harrison didn't like people rewriting facts. He looked back at Greg. "Assisted?" Greg kept smiling. "Yes." Michael leaned forward slightly. "Greg." "Yes?" "Daniel sent me the original version of this model 2 months ago." Silence. The kind of silence that makes people stop breathing. Stephanie looked down at the table. One of the directors shifted in his chair. Greg blinked, then tried to recover. "Well, the team has been collaborating." Michael raised a hand, and Greg stopped talking. "I don't mind collaboration," Michael said calmly. "But I do mind confusion." He tapped the slide on the screen. "This model was presented to me by Daniel Mercer." He looked directly at Greg. "Which is why I'm curious about something." Greg swallowed. "Yes? Why did I receive an email yesterday saying Daniel is no longer leading the project?" Now the room felt smaller. Greg forced a small laugh. "We're restructuring the team." Michael didn't react. "Why?" Greg opened his mouth, then closed it. "Because the real reason didn't sound very good anymore." "He missed a deadline," Greg said finally. Stephanie almost choked again. Michael looked at me. "Did you?" "No." Michael looked back at Greg. "Then why is the project late?" Greg hesitated. "The data integration." Michael interrupted him. "My operations team updated the reporting system." "Yes. That was communicated 3 weeks ago." Greg said nothing. "Because he hadn't read the email." "I had," Michael continued calmly. "So the delay was expected?" "Yes," I said. Michael nodded. "Which means the timeline adjustment was normal." "Yes." Then he turned slowly back toward Greg. "So let me make sure I understand this correctly." Greg shifted uncomfortably. "You removed the lead analyst from our project for a delay that was already explained." Greg tried again. "It's about accountability." Michael's voice became slightly colder. "Greg." "Yes?" "I don't care about internal politics." The room went completely silent. "I care about results." Greg stopped talking, because the word results had been the exact word he used to humiliate me the day before. Michael continued. "And Daniel has been delivering results for us for 2 years." Greg's jaw tightened. "But Ridgewell assigned the account to me," he said. Michael nodded. "Yes. But Ridgewell did not create the relationship." That sentence hit the room like a hammer, because everyone suddenly understood something important. The Harrison Logistics contract did not belong to Greg. It belonged to trust. And that trust had a name. Danielle Mercer. Michael leaned back again. So let me ask a very simple question. Greg forced a smile. Yes? If Daniel is no longer leading the project, who is? Greg gestured toward Stephanie. Stephanie will be taking over. Michael turned toward her. Stephanie looked like she wished the floor would open beneath her chair. Have you worked with Harrison Logistics before? Michael asked. No. Do you know our distribution network? Not yet. Have you reviewed the warehouse optimization model? I just received the files yesterday. Michael nodded slowly, then looked back at Greg. You replaced the only person who understands our logistics network with someone who has never worked with us before. Greg tried to sound confident. She'll learn quickly. Michael didn't smile. I'm sure she will. Then he said something very quietly. But that's not really the point. Greg frowned. What do you mean? Michael folded his hands on the table. The point is trust. Greg said nothing. Michael looked around the room, then spoke clearly. Harrison Logistics chose Ridgewell Advisory because of Daniel Mercer. No one in the room moved. Greg stared at him. You're saying, I'm saying, Michael continued, that when Daniel first shared his distribution analysis with us, it was the most intelligent strategy proposal we had received from any consulting firm. Greg's face slowly turned pale. And that, Michael finished, is why we signed the contract. Now the room understood everything. Greg hadn't won the client. Greg had inherited the client. Greg tried one last time. Michael, Ridgewell is a large firm. We have many capable consultants. Michael nodded politely. I'm sure you do. But we're not hiring a firm. We're hiring expertise. Then he turned toward me again. Daniel. Yes? Are you still with Ridgewell? I hesitated. Because suddenly, every person in the room was watching. Greg. Stephanie. The directors. Everyone. Yes, I said. Michael nodded. Good. Then he looked back at Greg. Because if he wasn't, he paused. This meeting would be very different. Greg didn't ask what that meant. Because he already knew. Without Daniel Mercer, Ridgewell Advisory might lose its biggest client. The meeting ended 15 minutes later. Greg tried to recover, tried to steer the conversation back to strategy, but the tone had changed. Michael was polite, professional, but the trust in the room had shifted, and Greg could feel it. When Michael stood up to leave, he shook Greg's hand again. Thank you for the presentation. Of course. Then he turned toward me. Daniel. Yes? Walk with me. Greg's face tightened. But he couldn't object, because the client had just asked. And in consulting, the client always wins. We walked down the hallway together, past the glass offices, past the analysts pretending not to watch us, until we reached the elevators. Michael pressed the button, then looked at me. You didn't tell them. About what? That you brought us the contract. I didn't think it mattered. He smiled slightly. It mattered to me. The elevator doors opened. But before stepping inside, Michael said something that made my heart skip for a second. Daniel, agrabtions of Krakta. Yes? If you ever decide to leave Ridgewell, call me first. The elevator doors closed, and I stood there in the hallway, realizing something important. Greg Whitman had tried to humiliate me in front of the entire office. But now the most important client in the company had just made it very clear who they actually trusted. And when Greg walked out of the conference room a minute later, the expression on his face told me something else. He finally understood. Removing me from the Harrison account might have been the biggest mistake of his career. When the elevator doors closed behind Michael Harrison, the hallway outside the conference room became strangely quiet. For a few seconds, no one moved. It felt like the moment after a storm passes. Everyone knows something important just happened, but no one wants to be the first person to say it out loud. Then the conference room door opened. Greg Whitman stepped out, and, for the first time since I had worked at Ridgewell, he didn't look confident. He looked angry. Not the loud kind of anger. The quiet kind. The kind that sits behind someone's eyes while they try to figure out how much damage was just done. He looked at me, then quickly looked away. Daniel, he said. Yes? My office. Greg's office was the largest one on the floor. Glass walls. City view. 2 leather chairs across from his desk. Usually when someone was called into Greg's office, it meant a lecture, or a performance review, or a warning. Today felt different. He closed the door, then stood with his back to the window for a moment. Silent. Thinking. Finally, he spoke. What did you tell him? Who? Harrison. I didn't tell him anything. Greg narrowed his eyes. That's hard to believe. Why? Because he walked into that meeting acting like you were still running the account. I shrugged slightly. That's probably because I was. Greg exhaled slowly. You know what I mean. Yes. I asked you a question. And I answered it. Greg leaned forward slightly. You embarrassed me in front of a client. That made me pause. Because the sentence sounded familiar. Very familiar. It was almost identical to what he had done to me the day before. I didn't embarrass you, I said calmly. You asked a question. And the client answered it. Greg's jaw tightened. You're playing games. No. I'm telling the truth. That's not the same thing. I tilted my head. Usually it is. Greg walked back to his desk and sat down. He opened his laptop, closed it again, then looked at me carefully. You know how important this account is to the firm. Yes. You know what losing Harrison Logistics would mean. Yes. Greg tapped his fingers on the desk. 40% of our revenue. I know. So let's stop pretending this is a personal argument. I raised an eyebrow. It became personal yesterday. Greg ignored that. What Harrison said in that meeting was not helpful. You mean when he said the client trusted me? Greg's expression hardened. Yes. Well, I said quietly. That's what he said. Greg stood up again and walked toward the glass wall, looking down at the city. You've created a problem. No. You have. The client trusts you more than the firm. That's not my decision, but it's the reality. I didn't respond. Because he was right. And we both knew it. Greg turned back toward me. So here's what's going to happen. I waited. You're going back on the Harrison account. That surprised me. I thought I was replaceable. Greg didn't smile. This isn't about yesterday. It sounded like it. This is about protecting the firm. I crossed my arms slightly. Protecting the firm or protecting yourself? Greg's eyes flashed. You think this is funny? No. I think it's predictable. He stared at me. You should be grateful. For what? For the opportunity to keep your job. That was the moment something inside the room shifted. Because Greg believed something that was no longer true. He believed I needed Ridgewell. But after the conversation in the hallway, I wasn't sure that was the case anymore. I'll think about it, I said. Greg blinked. You'll think about it? Yes. You work here. Yes. You don't get to think about it. I might. Greg leaned forward. Daniel. Yes? Don't make this harder than it needs to be. I nodded slowly. That advice might have helped yesterday. I left Greg's office and walked back toward my desk. Stephanie looked up immediately. Well, he wants me back on the project. Her eyes widened. Of course he does. I said I'd think about it. You what? I said I'd think about it. Stephanie stared at me like I had just said something insane. You know that account basically controls your promotion, right? I know. And Greg just admitted he needs you. Yes. So why hesitate? I sat down at my desk. Because the answer was more complicated than she realized. Because the client asked me something in the hallway. Stephanie leaned closer. What? If I ever leave Ridgewell, I should call him first. Stephanie froze. Oh. Yes. Oh. She sat back in her chair slowly. That changes things. Yes. The rest of the office felt different that afternoon. Word spreads quickly in consulting firms. Especially when the biggest client in the company challenges a senior partner during a meeting. People tried to act normal. But I could see it in the way they looked at me. Curiosity. Speculation. Even a little respect. Greg's door stayed closed for most of the afternoon. Which meant one thing. He was on the phone. Probably with the partners. Explaining what happened. Trying to control the story. But stories are hard to control when multiple people witnessed the same moment. And everyone had seen Michael Harrison say the same thing. We chose Ridgewell because of Daniel Mercer. Around 6 in the evening, most of the office had gone home. Stephanie packed her laptop and stood up. You staying late? For a bit. Thinking about Greg's offer? Something like that. She nodded. Well, whatever you decide. Greg's going to regret yesterday for the rest of his life. She left. The office lights dimmed automatically. The city outside the window glowed with evening traffic. And then my phone buzzed again. A new message. From Michael Harrison. Dinner? I stared at the message for a moment. Then replied. Where? Riverside Grill. Sue. Tredive. That was in 20 minutes. which meant this wasn't a casual conversation. Riverside Grill was one of those quiet restaurants executives use for private conversations. Dim lights, corner booths, soft music. Michael was already there when I arrived. He stood up when I approached the table. Daniel. Michael. We shook hands. Then sat down. The waiter brought water. Left us alone. For a moment, Michael just looked at me, studying my face. You handled that meeting well, he said. I answered questions. You did more than that. What do you mean? You stayed calm. I shrugged. I've worked with Greg for 2 years. Michael laughed softly. I imagine that requires patience. Yes. He folded his hands on the table. So, are you staying at Ridgewell? That depends. On what? On whether they trust the people doing the work. Michael nodded slowly. That's fair. Then he said something that surprised me. You know, Daniel, I've been thinking about something. What? Our consulting contract. I waited. It expires in 6 months. Yes. And we've been reviewing our options. Options? Other consulting firms. That didn't surprise me. Companies like Harrison Logistics always review contracts. But Michael continued. There's one problem. What's that? We're not really hiring a firm. We're hiring expertise. I recognized the phrase. He had used it earlier in the conference room. You mean me? I mean the person who understands our logistics network. Then he leaned forward slightly. And that person is you. I didn't respond. Because I knew where this conversation might be heading. But I needed to hear him say it. Daniel, Michael said quietly. Yes? What would it take for you to leave Ridgewell? The question hung in the air between us. Because that question had the power to change everything. I looked out the restaurant window at the river. Then back at him. That's a big question. Yes. And the answer could be expensive. Michael smiled slightly. That's not usually a problem. Then he said the sentence that changed the direction of the entire story. What if you ran the consulting strategy for Harrison Logistics directly? I blinked. You mean internally? Yes. As head of logistics strategy. For a moment, I didn't speak. Because the offer was much bigger than a consulting role. It was leadership. Real authority. Real decision-making power. And most importantly, freedom from people like Greg Whitman. Michael continued. You already understand our network. You already understand our problems. And more importantly, you care about solving them. I leaned back in my chair. You're serious. Yes, very serious. Then he said something that made the offer even more interesting. If you leave Ridgewell, we won't renew their consulting contract, which meant something enormous. If I accepted Michael's offer, Ridgewell would lose its biggest client, 40% of its revenue, Greg Whitman's most important account. I looked at Michael. You realize what that would do to them? Yes. And you're okay with that? Michael shrugged slightly. We hire consultants to solve problems, not create them. The waiter returned briefly, placed 2 plates on the table, then left again. Neither of us touched the food, because the conversation was far more important. I looked down at the table, then back at Michael. You're asking me to make a decision that could destroy someone's career. Michael nodded calmly. Yes. And what do you think I should do? He smiled slightly. I think you should do what's best for your career. Then he added quietly. And maybe what's fair. I sat there in silence for a moment. Because suddenly, the humiliation Greg had created the day before had turned into something much bigger, much more powerful. And as I looked across the table at Michael Harrison, I realized something. Greg Whitman believed he still controlled the future of the Harrison account. But the truth was, the future of that account was now sitting in front of me. And the decision was mine. I didn't answer Michael Harrison that night. Not immediately. And that surprised him. Most people, when they're offered a position like the one he described, don't hesitate. They say yes. Or, at least they pretend not to be shocked. But decisions like that, the kind that can change multiple careers, should never be made in a restaurant over dinner. Give me a few days, I said finally. Michael nodded. That's reasonable. I don't want to make a decision based on emotion. That's exactly why I trust your judgment. He took a sip of water, then added something quietly. But don't take too long. Why? Because Ridgewell is going to realize something very soon. What? That the person they embarrassed yesterday is also the person holding their biggest client. I smiled slightly. That realization might already be happening. The next morning, I understood exactly what Michael meant. Because when I walked into the Ridgewell office, the atmosphere was completely different. People were talking, quietly, but constantly. Two analysts near the coffee machine stopped mid-sentence when I passed them. A project manager glanced at me, then quickly looked back at her laptop, and Stephanie walked straight toward me the moment I stepped into the office. Daniel, what's going on? She lowered her voice. The partners are here. All of them? Yes. That was unusual. Ridgewell had 5 senior partners. They almost never appeared in the office at the same time, especially not without warning. Why? I asked. Stephanie gave me the look people give when the answer should be obvious. Because of yesterday, the door to Greg's office was open, which meant the partners were inside the main boardroom. Through the glass walls, I could see them sitting around the long table. 5 senior partners. Greg Whitman. And a stack of financial reports spread across the table. That was never a good sign. Stephanie leaned closer. They've been in there for an hour. Talking about what? Harrison Logistics. Of course. Because Michael Harrison had not just challenged Greg in the meeting. He had said something much more dangerous. We chose Ridgewell because of Daniel Mercer. In consulting firms, clients are supposed to trust the firm, not an individual employee. When that balance shifts, the firm loses control. And senior partners hate losing control. My phone buzzed. An enter now message. From Greg. Conference room. Now. Stephanie saw the message appear on my screen. Good luck, she whispered. Thanks. I walked toward the conference room. Inside, Greg was standing alone. The door closed behind me. He didn't sit. He didn't offer coffee. He just looked at me. You had dinner with Harrison last night. It wasn't a question. No, I said calmly. It was a conversation. Greg's eyes narrowed. What did you talk about? Strategy. That's not funny. I wasn't trying to be funny. Greg walked slowly toward the window. Do you know what's happening in that boardroom right now? They're discussing the Harrison account. They're discussing risk. I waited. Greg turned back toward me. They're discussing you. That's flattering. It's dangerous. How? Greg leaned forward slightly. They think the client relationship belongs to you. That's because it does. Greg's jaw tightened. It belongs to Ridgewell. Then Ridgewell should probably make sure the client believes that. Greg didn't respond. Because we both knew the truth. Michael Harrison didn't trust Ridgewell. He trusted me. Greg rubbed his temples. Let me be very clear about something. Okay. If Harrison Logistics leaves, this firm loses 40% of its revenue. I know. That affects everyone. I know. Jobs. Bonuses. Partnership shares. I understand. Greg stared at me. Do you? Yes. Then stop acting like this is a game. I'm not. Greg's voice lowered. Did Harrison offer you something? That question came faster than I expected. I didn't answer. Greg noticed. What did he offer you? Why do you assume he offered anything? Because clients don't invite consultants to dinner after meetings like that. He paused. Unless something is happening. Silence filled the room. Greg looked at me carefully, then said something very slowly. Are you leaving the firm? Before I could answer, the door opened. One of the senior partners stepped inside. His name was Robert Klein, 60 years old, co-founder of Ridgewell Advisory. The person who actually controlled the firm. Daniel, he said calmly. Yes? The partners would like to speak with you. Greg didn't look happy about that, but he stepped aside. And suddenly I realized something important. This conversation was no longer just about Greg. It was about the future of the entire company. The boardroom felt different from the last time I had been there. More serious. More controlled. 5 senior partners sat around the table. Robert Klein gestured toward an empty chair. Please sit. I did. The partners studied me quietly, like investors examining a risk. Finally, Robert spoke. We had an interesting meeting yesterday. I noticed. Harrison Logistics made some strong statements. Yes. Robert folded his hands. We want to understand the situation. Which part? The client relationship. Okay. Robert nodded. How did Ridgewell acquire the Harrison contract? The question hung in the air. Greg shifted in his seat. But Robert didn't look at Greg. He looked at me. I answered honestly. I introduced the client to the firm. One of the partners raised an eyebrow. You introduced them personally? Yes. Greg tried to speak. But Robert lifted a hand. Let him finish. I continued. I had an existing professional relationship with Michael Harrison. And you recommended Ridgewell? Yes. Robert nodded slowly. That wasn't in the CRM notes. I didn't enter the contract. Now the partners looked at Greg. Greg cleared his throat. It was a team effort. Robert didn't comment. But the silence said enough. Another partner spoke. A woman named Linda Park. Daniel, she said calmly. How strong is your relationship with the client? They trust my analysis. That's not what I asked. She leaned forward slightly. If you left Ridgewell, would Harrison Logistics stay with us? That was the question everyone in the room wanted answered. I took a moment before replying. Probably not. Silence. Greg looked furious. Robert Klein leaned back in his chair. So we have a dependency risk. Linda nodded. A major one. Greg finally spoke. We can rebuild the relationship. Robert looked at him. How long would that take? Greg hesitated. Robert continued. 6 months? 12? The room stayed quiet. Because everyone knew the truth. Clients like Harrison Logistics don't transfer trust overnight. Robert turned back toward me. Daniel. Yes? What do you want? The question surprised me. Excuse me. You heard me. Robert's voice remained calm. You clearly have leverage. And you clearly understand the value of this account. So I'm asking you directly. What do you want from this firm? Greg stared at him in disbelief. But Robert didn't look away from me. For a moment, I didn't answer. Because the answer was more complicated than salary or promotion. It was about respect, about ownership, about not being treated like someone who could be humiliated in front of an entire team. Finally, I spoke. I want the authority to run the Harrison account properly. Greg immediately objected. That's not how the firm operates. Robert raised his hand again. Greg. Greg stopped. Robert looked back at me. Anything else? Yes. What? I want the strategy work recognized accurately. Linda nodded slightly. That seems reasonable. Greg looked like he wanted to argue. But Robert spoke first. And if we offer that? I met his eyes. Then I'll consider staying. Greg leaned forward. That's not good enough. Robert looked at him. Greg. Yes? You created this situation. Greg said nothing. The meeting ended 20 minutes later. But the message was clear. The partners now understood something Greg had been trying to avoid. The Harrison account was tied to me. And if I left, Ridgewell might lose its biggest client. When I walked back into the main office, Stephanie was waiting. Well? The partners are thinking. That sounds scary. It probably is. She hesitated. Did you tell them? Tell them what? About Harrison. No. Her eyes widened. You didn't tell them about the job offer. Not yet. Stephanie stared at me. You realize something, right? What? If you leave, Greg's career is basically over. I looked back toward the boardroom, where the partners were still talking, and for the first time since this whole situation started, I realized something important. Greg Whitman had tried to humiliate me in front of the entire office, but now the decision that could destroy his career was sitting in my hands. And the partners at Ridgewell were only just beginning to understand that. Later that evening, my phone buzzed again. A message from Michael Harrison. Have you made your decision yet? I stared at the screen, because the truth was, the real consequences of that decision were only starting to unfold. The morning after the partners' meeting, I arrived at the office earlier than usual. Not because I had a deadline, not because I had a client call, but because something had changed inside the company, and everyone could feel it. When a consulting firm realizes its largest client might walk away, things move very quickly. The elevator doors opened to the 22nd floor. Normally, the office would still be quiet at 8 a.m. But today, almost every desk was occupied. People were already working. Phones ringing. Whispers moving across the room like invisible currents. 2 analysts near the printer stopped talking when they saw me. One of them gave me a polite nod. The other avoided eye contact completely. Stephanie walked straight toward me the moment I stepped inside. You're here early, she said. So is everyone else. She lowered her voice. The partners stayed here until almost midnight. Talking about Harrison? Yes. And you? That didn't surprise me. Because the situation had become very simple. If I stayed, Ridgewell kept the client. If I left, the firm might lose almost half its revenue. In consulting firms, that kind of risk becomes everyone's problem. Very quickly, before I could even sit down, another message appeared on my phone. From Robert Klein. Daniel, please come to the boardroom. Stephanie saw the message. Already? Looks like it. She gave me a sympathetic smile. Well, try not to accidentally bankrupt the company. Good advice. The boardroom felt different again that morning. More focused. Less confrontational. Robert Klein was already there. Linda Park sat beside him. Two other partners, Greg Whitman, and a thick stack of printed financial reports. Greg didn't look at me when I walked in. He stared at the table, which told me something important. This was no longer his meeting. Robert gestured toward the chair. Daniel. I sat down. Robert spoke calmly. We've reviewed the situation. Yes. The Harrison account is critical to this firm. I'm aware. Linda leaned forward slightly. We want to resolve this professionally. That sounds good. Robert nodded. So we're going to make you an offer. Greg shifted in his seat. But he didn't interrupt. Robert slid a document across the table toward me. Senior Director of Strategic Consulting. I read the title again. That role didn't exist yesterday. Linda continued. You would have full authority over the Harrison account and any future logistics clients. Greg looked like he wanted to argue, but Robert didn't give him the chance. Your compensation would also change. I turned the page and paused because the number was significant. Salary increase, performance bonuses, equity participation. It wasn't just a promotion. It was the kind of offer consulting firms make when they are trying to solve a problem quickly. Robert watched my reaction carefully. Is that something you would consider? I closed the folder slowly. It's generous. Linda smiled slightly. We thought you might say that. Greg finally spoke. This is highly unusual. Robert looked at him calmly. So is losing 40% of our revenue. Greg said nothing. I leaned back slightly in my chair. You're asking me to stay? Robert nodded. Yes, because of Harrison. Yes. Not because of yesterday. Robert's voice remained steady. Yesterday was a mistake. Greg looked up sharply, but Robert didn't take the comment back. Linda added something quietly. Sometimes firms forget where value actually comes from. The room went silent. Greg's face turned slightly red, but he didn't respond. Robert turned back toward me. So the question becomes simple. What do you want to do? Before I could answer, my phone buzzed. Everyone at the table noticed. Robert nodded toward the phone. You can check that. I glanced at the screen. One message. From Michael Harrison. Our board just finished reviewing the consulting contract. My heart skipped slightly. Another message appeared immediately. We're making a decision today. I looked up at the partners. Excuse me for a moment. Robert nodded. Of course. I stepped outside into the hallway and called him. He answered immediately. Daniel. Michael. You picked an interesting day to have internal meetings. You could say that. He laughed softly. I assume Ridgewell is trying to keep you. Yes. Promotion? Yes. More money? Yes. That sounds about right. I leaned against the wall. So what decision did your board make? Michael paused. Just long enough to make the moment uncomfortable. Then he said it. We're terminating the consulting contract. For a moment, I didn't speak, because that was much faster than I expected. You're sure? Yes. Our board voted this morning. That's decisive. Michael's voice remained calm. We need leadership on this strategy. And right now we don't trust Ridgewell to provide it. I understood exactly what he meant. Because trust had been the real issue since the meeting. When does the contract end? I asked. Immediately. That was even more shocking. That's unusual. Yes. But legally possible. Michael continued. We'll pay the termination clause. And then? Then we build the strategy internally. I already knew where that sentence was heading. Which brings us back to our conversation. Yes. Michael spoke clearly. The offer still stands. Head of Logistics Strategy. Yes. Starting next month. And if I say yes? Then Harrison Logistics moves forward. And if I say no? We'll find someone else. But the way he said it made something obvious. They didn't want someone else. They wanted me. When I walked back into the boardroom, everyone looked up. Robert studied my expression carefully. That didn't look like a casual call. No. What happened? I placed the folder back on the table. Harrison Logistics just terminated the consulting contract. Silence exploded across the room. Greg sat up instantly. That's impossible. Linda looked at me. You're certain? Yes. Robert's voice became very quiet. When? This morning. Greg stood up. They can't do that. They can. The contract. They're paying the termination clause. Greg stared at me. What did you say to them? I answered their questions. That's not enough to cancel a contract, Robert interrupted. Greg. Greg stopped talking. Robert looked at me. Did they say why? Yes. What was the reason? I repeated Michael's words. They don't trust the firm to lead the strategy. Linda closed her eyes briefly. Greg ran both hands through his hair. This is a disaster. Robert remained calm. No, it's a consequence. Greg looked at him in disbelief. Robert turned back toward me. And where does that leave you? I hesitated. Because this was the moment everything connected. The humiliation. The client. The offer. The future. Harrison Logistics offered me a position. Greg froze. Robert nodded slowly. What position? Head of Logistics Strategy. Linda looked impressed. That's a major role. Greg's voice cracked slightly. You're not actually considering that. I looked at him. Because suddenly, the man who humiliated me in front of the entire office looked genuinely worried. This situation didn't start with me, I said. Greg didn't respond. Because we both knew exactly when it started. The moment he stood in the conference room and said, "People like you are replaceable." Robert folded his hands on the table. Daniel. Yes? You're in a powerful position. That's one way to describe it. We'd like to keep you here. I understand. But the decision is yours. The room fell silent again. 5 partners watching me. Greg watching me. The future of the company sitting in the middle of the table. And suddenly I realized something. The humiliation Greg had created had turned into leverage. Real leverage. The kind that rarely appears in corporate life. I looked at the offer folder again. Then back at the partners. And for the first time since this whole situation started, I spoke with complete clarity. I'll give you my answer tomorrow. Greg followed me into the hallway after the meeting ended. Daniel. I stopped. You can't do this. Do what? Walk away. I didn't say I was. But you're thinking about it. Yes. Greg looked exhausted. You know what happens if you leave. I have an idea. This firm could collapse. That's not my responsibility. Greg stared at me for a long moment. Then he said something quietly. I made a mistake. That was the first honest sentence he had spoken in 2 days. Yes, I said. You did? That night, I sat in my apartment looking out over the Chicago skyline, 2 offers sitting in front of me. One from Ridgewell. One from Harrison Logistics. Both powerful. Both life-changing. But only one of them would decide what happened next. And tomorrow morning, I would finally give my answer. That night, I barely slept. Not because the decision was impossible, but because it was too clear. 2 offers sat on the kitchen table in front of me. One from Ridgewell Advisory. One from Harrison Logistics. Both life-changing. Both powerful, but only one of them was built on respect. The Ridgewell offer looked impressive on paper. Senior director. Major salary increase. Profit participation. Authority over the Harrison account. 2 days earlier, I would have considered it a dream promotion. The kind consultants spend years chasing. But now something about it felt different. Because the offer wasn't really about leadership. It was about damage control. The firm wasn't rewarding my work. They were protecting their revenue. 40% of it. And everyone in that boardroom knew it. Including Greg Whitman. The Harrison Logistics offer was much simpler. No consulting politics. No partner hierarchy. Just responsibility. Real responsibility. Running logistics strategy for a company that moved billions of dollars in goods every year. And more importantly, working directly with people who actually trusted my judgment. Michael Harrison had been very clear. We hire expertise. Not titles. Not presentations. Expertise. And that was something consulting firms sometimes forgot. At 7:30 the next morning, my phone buzzed. A message from Robert Klein. We're meeting at 9 a.m. Please come to the boardroom. They weren't wasting time. I stared at the message for a moment. Then replied, I'll be there. The Ridgewell office felt tense when I arrived. The kind of tension you feel when something important is about to happen. People were quieter than usual. Conversations stopped when someone walked by. Even the coffee machine sounded louder. Stephanie was already at her desk. She looked up the moment I entered. Today's the day. Yes. Have you decided? Yes. She leaned back in her chair slowly. Should I be worried? Probably. That bad? Depends on how you look at it. Stephanie studied my face carefully, then nodded. Well, whatever happens, Greg deserves it. At 8:55 a.m., I walked into the boardroom. Everyone was already there. Robert Klein, Linda Park, the other partners, Greg Whitman, and once again, that thick stack of financial reports. Robert gestured toward the chair. Daniel. I sat down. The room stayed quiet for a moment. Robert spoke first. We assume you've had time to think about our offer. Yes. And? His tone was calm. But everyone in the room was watching me closely. Because the answer would decide something much bigger than my career. It would decide what happened to the firm. I looked at Robert. Then at Linda. Then finally at Greg. Greg avoided my eyes. I've made my decision, I said. Robert nodded. Go ahead. I'm leaving Ridgewell. The silence that followed felt almost physical. One of the partners slowly exhaled. Linda closed her notebook. Greg looked up sharply. You can't be serious. I am. Robert remained calm. Are you joining Harrison Logistics? Yes. Greg stood up. This is insane. Robert didn't raise his voice. Sit down, Greg. Greg hesitated, but eventually sat back down. Robert looked at me. When would you start? Next month. Linda nodded slowly. That aligns with the contract termination. Yes. Robert leaned back in his chair. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he spoke quietly. I won't pretend this is good news for the firm. I understand. But I also won't pretend this decision came out of nowhere. Greg stared at him. What does that mean? Robert turned toward Greg. It means the situation was avoidable. Greg didn't respond. Because he knew exactly what Robert meant. The situation had started with one decision. One meeting. One sentence. People like you are replaceable. Robert turned back toward me. I'd like to ask one favor. What? A transition period. That's reasonable. 2 weeks. I nodded. That's fine. Greg shook his head in disbelief. You're just letting him walk away? Robert looked at him. What would you suggest? We fight it. Robert raised an eyebrow. Fight what? The client decision. Robert sighed quietly. Greg. Owed. Yes? Harrison Logistics just paid a multi-million-dollar termination clause. They're not coming back. Greg fell silent. Because even he understood that. The meeting ended soon after. The partners began discussing internal restructuring, budget adjustments, client diversification, words consultants use when revenue suddenly disappears. I stood up to leave. Robert walked with me toward the hallway. Daniel. Yes? I want to say something. Okay. You handled this situation professionally. Thank you. And despite everything, I'm glad you worked here. I am too. Robert smiled slightly. Just not under these circumstances. Exactly. Greg was waiting in the hallway, leaning against the glass wall. The moment Robert walked away, Greg spoke. You're destroying this firm. No. Yes, you are. You're confusing cause and effect. Greg stepped closer. You think Harrison cares about you? He cares about the work. They'll replace you in a year. Maybe. Greg shook his head. You just ended your consulting career. I started a different one. Greg stared at me for a long moment, then asked quietly, was it worth it? I thought about the meeting 2 days earlier. The conference room. The team sitting around the table. Greg standing at the front of the room saying, if someone can't deliver results, they become replaceable. Then I looked back at him. Yes. By lunchtime, the news had spread across the entire office. Consulting firms operate on information. And when the biggest client leaves, everyone knows within hours. Stephanie came over to my desk. So it's official? Yes. You're leaving? Yes. For Harrison Logistics? Yes. She leaned against the desk. That's huge. It's different. Greg looks like someone unplugged his power supply. That sounds accurate. Stephanie lowered her voice. You know what people are saying, right? What? That you just cost the firm 40% of its revenue. I shook my head. No. What do you mean? I didn't cost them anything. Greg did. Later that afternoon, I received another message from Michael Harrison. Did you make your decision? I replied. Yes. A few seconds passed. Then his response appeared. Welcome to the team. I smiled slightly. Because, just like that, the consulting firm where I had worked for 2 years was now part of my past. But the story wasn't over yet. Not even close. Because 3 weeks later, I would walk back into the Ridgewell office again. Not as an employee, but as something very different. And when Greg Whitman saw me sitting at the head of the conference table, he finally understood the full cost of the mistake he made that Monday morning. 3 weeks later, I walked back into the Ridgewell advisory office. But this time, I wasn't an employee, and that single difference changed everything. The elevator ride up to the 22nd floor felt strangely familiar. Same building, same quiet hum of machinery, same mirrored walls. 3 weeks earlier, I had stepped into this elevator as a consultant working late hours for a firm that barely noticed the work behind its biggest client. I was writing up as head of logistics strategy for Harrison Logistics, which meant something very important. I wasn't there to ask for work anymore. I was there to decide who got it. The project itself was simple on paper. Harrison Logistics had decided to move forward with the distribution overhaul I had designed months earlier, but implementing it would require external consulting support, large-scale data integration, infrastructure planning, operational modeling, exactly the type of work consulting firms specialize in. Michael Harrison had asked me one simple question the week before: which firm should we bring in? And that question had made me pause, because there were dozens of consulting firms capable of doing the work. Global firms, specialized logistics consultants, technology advisory companies. But in the end, I recommended Ridgewell Advisory, not because they deserved it, but because they needed it. And because sometimes, the most powerful form of closure is letting someone see the consequences of their actions from the other side of the table. The elevator doors opened. The reception area looked exactly the same. The same marble desk, the same waiting chairs, the same receptionist, except when she looked up and saw me, her eyes widened slightly. Daniel? Hi, Karen. You're back? For a meeting. With who? The consulting team. Karen blinked. Oh. She quickly checked her calendar. Yes. Conference room B. Then she added quietly. Everyone's already waiting. Of course they were. Because when Harrison Logistics calls a meeting, consulting firms show up early. As I walked through the office, people noticed. Some recognized me immediately. Others looked twice before realizing who I was. Whispers followed quietly behind me, which was understandable. 3 weeks earlier, I had left the firm after the largest client in company history terminated their contract, and now I was walking back in, wearing a Harrison Logistics badge. Stephanie was the first familiar face I saw. She stepped out from behind a row of desks and stared at me. You're kidding. Hi, Stephanie. She laughed. You're actually back. For a meeting. With Ridgewell? Yes. Her eyes widened. Oh my God. What? You're the client now. Yes. Stephanie shook her head slowly. I knew this would happen. I just didn't think it would happen this fast. She lowered her voice. Greg's in the conference room. I assumed he would be. Her expression shifted slightly. You know he's been different lately. How? Star? Quieter. That didn't surprise me. Losing 40% of a firm's revenue tends to change people. Conference room B looked exactly the way it always had. Long table, glass walls, city skyline behind it, but the seating arrangement was different. Consultants on one side of the table, client seats on the other. And this time, I was on the client side. When I walked in, every conversation stopped. Greg Whitman sat near the center of the table. 2 other senior consultants beside him. Several analysts. Stephanie slipped quietly into one of the chairs along the wall. Greg looked up. For a moment, his expression didn't change. Then recognition hit, and his face went completely still. Daniel. Greg. The room remained silent, because everyone present understood something. The power dynamic in the room had completely reversed. I sat down at the head of the client side of the table, opened my notebook, and spoke the same way Michael Harrison always did. Calm, direct, professional. Thank you for meeting with us. Greg cleared his throat. Of course. Harrison Logistics is evaluating consulting partners for our distribution transformation. Greg nodded. We appreciate the opportunity. I'm sure you do. The room stayed very quiet, because everyone remembered something Greg had said 3 weeks earlier. People like you are replaceable. And now the person he said that to was evaluating whether his firm deserved a second chance. I turned to the presentation screen. Let's begin. Greg stood up and walked to the front of the room, exactly the same way he had done during the meeting weeks earlier. Except this time, He looked slightly less confident. As you know, Greg began, Ridgewell Advisory has extensive experience in logistics strategy. He clicked the remote. Slides appeared on the screen. Operational frameworks, consulting methodologies, project timelines, standard consulting presentation material. I listened quietly, taking notes, occasionally asking questions. The room slowly relaxed, because the meeting felt normal, professional, structured, until Greg reached the final slide. We believe Ridgewell is uniquely qualified to support Harrison Logistics on this transformation. He looked at me. Do you have any questions? I closed my notebook. Yes, Greg nodded. Go ahead. I leaned back slightly in my chair. Who built the original distribution model? The room froze. Because everyone recognized the question. It was the same question Michael Harrison had asked 3 weeks earlier. Greg hesitated, then said carefully, the strategy team collaborated on that work. I waited, then asked again, who built the model? Greg looked uncomfortable. Finally, he said it. You did. I nodded slowly. That's correct. The room remained silent, because the moment was familiar, almost identical to the one that had started everything. I closed my notebook and looked directly at Greg. 3 weeks ago, you said something during a meeting. Greg didn't respond, but his eyes narrowed slightly. You said consulting is about results. That's correct. And you said something else. Greg shifted slightly. What? You said people who can't deliver results are replaceable. Now the room was completely still. No one moved. No one spoke. Because everyone remembered that meeting. I nodded slowly. You were right about that. Greg looked confused. I was? Yes. I stood up, walked slowly toward the front of the room. The same place Greg had stood when he humiliated me. Then I turned back toward the table. You were absolutely right. Greg said nothing. Because suddenly, he realized where the conversation was going. People are replaceable, I continued. But trust isn't. Silence filled the room. The kind of silence that makes every word feel heavier. I picked up my notebook. Thank you for your time. Greg blinked. That's it? Yes. You're not selecting Ridgewell? I looked at him calmly. No. Greg stared at me. Why? I paused for a moment. Not because I needed to think, but because sometimes the right ending deserves a moment. Then I answered, because results matter. I walked out of the conference room, past the analysts, past the glass offices, past the reception desk. Stephanie followed me into the hallway. Daniel. Yes? That was brutal. I smiled slightly. No. That was honest. She nodded slowly. Where are you going now? Back to work. She laughed softly. You know something? What? Greg's never going to forget that meeting. Probably not. The elevator doors opened. I stepped inside. And as the doors closed, I realized something interesting. 3 weeks earlier, Greg Whitman believed he had ended my career. But all he had really done was remind me of something important. In business, the people who actually create value are rarely the ones sitting quietly at the table. But eventually, the truth finds its way into the room. And when it does, the conversation changes. Completely.
This content is entirely fictional. Any similarity to real persons or events is coincidental. This video is not news, not a documentary. It is presented for creative storytelling purpose only. AI assisted production.